intro music, but that's okay. That's fine. I have a little bit of a cold right now, so I hope that I don't start sneezing, because that would sound probably awful amplified over all that. And then I would have to apologize more, and it would just be a whole talk about I'm sorries. But I'm really excited to give you this talk. It originally started off being called Designing for Transparency, and it kind of took a little different turn, though we will be covering design methodologies around designing for transparency and machine learning. But a lot of it is just sort of talking about what is AI and how it fits into the role of art and design. And I think AI is a lot more than just math. I'm Caroline. I am an artist and design researcher. I've been studying how people understand, relate, and then create within large systems and platforms like social networks for the past 7 years. I started looking at online harassment. That was a lot of my research, so that's why sometimes I make those faces having to read 4chan and 8chan. That's skeptical/anger. Ha ha ha. I've worked as a UX designer in advertising, a design researcher for IBM Watson, and I've held writing and arts residencies with BuzzFeed and IBM, Google's PAIR, that's the People in Artificial Intelligence Research Group. And I'm currently a fellow with Harvard University and the Mozilla Foundation, looking at explainable AI and what is the role of design within that. And I'm pretty narrowly focused on this one goal: how do we make AI understandable for everyone? How do we, as designers and technologists and content strategists and producers and engineers, as well as researchers and creators, make understandable AI, and what does that look like? And how does that affect things like product design? And I think a lot of it is good design. But before we get there, we should probably talk a little bit about what is artificial intelligence and machine learning. And it is math, so my title was a bit of a misnomer, but it's also code, and it's data sets, and it's intentional design. Algorithms are designed to do things, from translating speech into text to creating predictions from data, from recognizing and sorting images together or separately. Algorithms are really about how information is processed. So Kate Devlin, a professor in the UK, wrote a book all about artificial intelligence. In this book, she defines the concept of AI as the concept of machines being able to carry out tasks in an intelligible manner. So at present, none of the AI in use today actually involves machines being sentient or conscious, nor do they have any kind of general intelligence the way we think of organic mechanisms, animals, or people having intelligence. But rather, AI just uses data to understand patterns of outcomes, and they learn from previous situations. So AI, machine learning, and algorithms are really just, one could argue, pattern matching and sorting. But what really is AI? Well, there's another metaphor that I like, made by Mimi Onawa and Mother Cyborg, in a book they have called The People's Guide to AI. And they describe AI as being like salt. AI alone is not a product or really a feature. It's kind of a transformative ingredient. It's tech. Salt, for example, on its own is not really its own meal, and I don't know if you should just eat salt alone. I mean, I don't know, you do you. It's not really anything other than a flavor, and it's maybe not that interesting. It's really singular. Salt is a singular thing. But when combined with other ingredients, salt can completely change an entire meal. AI is transformative like that as an ingredient as well as a technical infrastructure. It transforms when it's used in product design, and it can transform how it's sort of implemented in our everyday life. And we have to take a step back because AI is also data. Data is as important as the algorithm and the code that's written, because data can help determine what the algorithm does. Data is used to train an algorithm in machine learning systems. So an algorithm that's designed to use social media data is trained on social media data. So data is incredibly important. And one could argue that data is key. So what is data? Data in machine learning can be a variety of things. It can be language, images, text, outputs from social media, the frequency of interactions, frequency of usage. It can be a lot of things related to SEO and marketing. But data is human outputs. All data that exists in the world at some point is created or comes from humans. Even as something as cold and mechanical as shipping logistics is still touched by humans or coordinated by humans or has a human touch. So there's nothing cold or mechanical at all about data. It's all people. It's inherently human. So I think we have to treat data as an extremely sensitive object, as an extremely precious kind of material. And I want to highlight some really interesting art projects that focus on data and algorithms. One of my favorites is by Mimi Onawa, who I've mentioned earlier. This is her project, The Library of Missing Data Sets. So Mimi describes this project as this. Missing data sets are otherwise blank spots in data-saturated spaces. The Library of Missing Data Sets that was created in 2016 is an ongoing physical repository of these things that have been excluded in a society where so much else is collected. And in some cases, that exclusion can be a form of protection. In other cases, what does it mean if that data set doesn't exist? So one thing that sort of comes to mind is facial recognition, for example, has a history of being really bad at recognizing different kinds of races. On one hand, if facial recognition is sort of deployed in a public space, it can be a form of protection to maybe not be seen by that system. But what happens if you're at a border crossing and a facial recognition system has a hard time recognizing your face? What does that feel like for the person? What happens? Are you detained? Where do you go? What is the opt-out or workaround within that scenario? It can be incredibly traumatic for someone at a border crossing. This is another project I like that sort of shows the fallibility of algorithms. This is Heather Dewey Hagborg's work called Probably Chelsea. What you're looking at are 30 different possible portraits of Chelsea Manning that are algorithmically generated by an analysis of her DNA and then 3D printed. What's interesting about these 30 portraits is that all of them are technically and programmatically accurate according to the algorithmic system and analysis Heather used. But none of these portraits actually look like Chelsea Manning. And what I like about this is it isn't about AI, but it does show what does it mean to be wrong or right. This is considered a highly likelihood. These results are considered to be like strong likelihoods of what Chelsea could look like from this system that Heather was using that is used a lot by different researchers who are looking at bioengineering and genetic analysis using machine learning, right? And it's such a perfect visual metaphor of then the wrongness or what happens when these things are implemented or can be implemented in society. And I find it fascinating as we start to think about what does it mean to learn from human data or take human data, which can be changing data, when it's fed into products, what that failure can look like. And maybe even going more within that, I want to highlight some other projects or some other actual things out in the world of where AI tends to go wrong. Because I think this sort of reinforces a deeper question of looking at data within these systems and where does data and technology come together and how does design affect that? So what you're looking at here are two Google search results. Does anyone want to guess what they are? Anybody? You can shout it out. No? Okay. Let me try to do this backwards. Okay, so on the side closest to me, with the majority of white women, that's what happens when you Google professional hair, and the other result is unprofessional hair. So this was discovered by a journalist at The Guardian in 2015, and Google has tried to course correct this. But the reason I bring this up is I don't think that anyone on the Google search team set out to create a really biased Google search result. I don't think that that was their intention at all. But what I find really interesting about this is it begs deeper questions around what kind of data sets were they using, what did the training process look like, and how diverse was the engineering team? What kind of QA process did this go through? Google Search is a product. It really is. We probably use it countless times every day, more times than we can even think about. If we were to ask users how often they use it. It's something that is a part of their day-to-day. What I find really interesting is starting to look at how these results sort of exist in that ecosystem as a product. Google has tried to course correct this, and if you try to replicate this search right now, it looks a little more equal, but you can still kind of tell that one is more biased than the other. And this is another one I want to highlight that's problematic, and maybe a little bit more intentionally so. I'm American, I'm from New Orleans, Louisiana, and New Orleans for the past couple of years, was working with Palantir on looking at reducing crime in the city of New Orleans. Well, to unpack why this is so problematic, there's a few things you need to know. Throughout the majority of the collaboration, the city, its citizens, as well as local city council members had no idea this collaboration was happening. So there was no public information on Palantir working with the New Orleans Police Department. But to even get to the heart of why it's so problematic, we have to go back in time. New Orleans is a port city, and a large majority of slaves that entered the United States during the slave trade entered through New Orleans. As for police forces in the US, the modern police force actually comes from overseers and groups formed to watch and police slaves and freed people of color. So the history of policing in the United States is a really dark and violent and complicated past. In the US, especially in New Orleans, black neighborhoods are monitored and over-policed way more than white neighborhoods. So the arrest data that's even collected in the city of New Orleans is already inherently biased. So if a technology group or partnership is working with the New Orleans Police Department and using data from historical arrests, we already have to ask the question of what will be the output of that collaboration? What kind of product are they making, and how accurate are those results when you look at this history of biased data? But then we have to look at the context of where the sort of product is placed, the fact that it was kept secret, that there was no way to audit, and there's no way to actually really clearly explain the results and what the results were to everyday constituents. And I argue that this is a form of product design, and it's really harmful because everything about this is really intentional. Writing software is incredibly intentional. Making a product is intentional. Someone planned it, someone made it, someone sold it, and someone bought it. So when thinking about artificial intelligence and how it impacts society, it's important to think about it's not just the algorithms, it's the training data that's used and the intentions of the product. Bad AI isn't just because algorithms are broken, it's a lot of understanding the nuances of society and how that data set interacts with society and where product design fits into that conversation. It's also how you unintentionally train your algorithms, how that can change the product and harm the users. Which maybe brings us to how do we try to combat this kind of harm? And this is maybe the crux of my talk. How can we think about designing more transparently with machine learning? I think we can start to look at projects that already exist out in the wild, as well as other kinds of methodologies, like open source. We need a harm reduction applied to AI software and products, which means thinking about what does accessibility mean? How can we make AI more accessible through code releases that are open maybe to external audits, to data sets that the public can dig into and see, and then explanations and visual explanations about how the algorithm was made, how old it is, and who made it. There are many different ways in which design is culpable in trying to explain what AI is. I'm going to show you some different projects that I really like. And I'm bringing up Common Voice not because I'm a Mozilla fellow, but because I actually really like it. And I think Common Voice is great to show why data is so important. Common Voice is an open source data set created by the Mozilla Foundation. It's one of the largest public domain transcribed voice data sets ever made. It has more than 1,400 hours of voice data with 18 languages represented. Now one could argue why we would even need an open source voice data set. Because voice-to-text automation is the frontier of creating more accessible products. This is AI helping in disability. Common Voice supports multiple languages, which means it can help starting to support and understand multiple dialects and accents, which is something that Siri from Apple doesn't do so well with. But any of us in this room can use Common Voice. Another project I want to highlight is an art project of mine, which is an open source project in the making called Feminist Data Set. I had this idea when I was studying language and toxicity inside of algorithms when I was studying online harassment and the American alt-right, which meant I spent a lot of time looking at traumatic data, such as conversations the American alt-right was engaging in on different social networks like Discord, Reddit, 4chan, and 8chan. I ended up making a vocabulary of slang words that they were using, which is currently used by different journalist groups, as well as hate speech watchdog groups to analyze these conversations at a large scale. And I realized that I needed something to kind of help create a breather in what I was looking at, because I was looking at hate speech all day, every day. And I wanted to make something that was the opposite, hence Feminist Data Set. But the interesting thing about Feminist Data Set is it's taking something called intersectional feminism, which is a critical theory framework, and applying it to every step of the machine learning process. So part of this is assembling works, such as written feminist works, be it song lyrics, podcasts, transcripts, interviews, essays, etc., that are being put into a public repository as an archive. Then that archive will be used to sort of create and train a data model, which will eventually create a feminist chatbot. It's my way of intervening in AI. But where does design fit into this? Well, at every step of the machine learning pipeline, I have to look at every tool that I'm using and analyze it as if it fits the framework of intersectional feminism, which means that a lot of the tools that are used in machine learning, like Crowdflower or Amazon Mechanical Turk, are things that I cannot use. Amazon Mechanical Turk is widely used to train a data model. I can't use it in a very specific way because Amazon Mechanical Turk doesn't have or doesn't generate a living wage. People are barely paid what's called a minimum wage. So I'm trying to create an open source and ethical version around it. The backbone of machine learning is a lot of human labor in annotating and classifying sentences and images to make better models. And this is where Mechanical Turk is used, right? So this art project is a very real way for me to interrogate and examine what ethical means in AI under a specific framework. The project right now, which will part of it will launch at MozFest in a couple of weeks, is a calculator that helps creators and researchers price tasks for data modeling that can result in a living wage for the data labelers, thus trying to overcome the inadequacies and how little they are currently paid. Because being paid a living wage for a hidden and unseen but very necessary labor is important. Equal pay is real, and I would argue that's a major tenet under intersectional feminism. Here's an example of Feminist Data Set being installed at the Victoria and Albert Museum. A lot of this is sort of pulling from different frameworks that myself and others in the human rights space are looking at when it comes to creating with AI. And what a lot of us have come up with is this new form of human-centered design, which is human rights-centered design. We think we need a new framework for creating with AI that goes beyond data accountability and creation. We need human rights-centered design. Human rights-centered design is inspired by the UN's International Declaration on Human Rights and Frameworks, which outlines basic inalienable rights afforded to all people, which is about sovereignty for the individual. And I want to argue that sovereignty and dignity is user agency, especially in relationship to data ownership, when enacted in design and technology. So to create, how would we start to create within this? Well, we aren't giving consumers a lot of ways to opt out, to change or adjust how algorithms affect them within a product. We aren't asking them to say yes, and we definitely aren't letting them say no. So we aren't giving users ways to remove their data from a data model or transform or interact even with that model. Which brings me to designing for transparency. This is a project I'm also working on at Mozilla, which is inspired by two manifestos and checklists that exist out in the world that all of you can use: the Secure UX Checklist and the Consensual Software Manifesto. My project outlines 3 principles for designing with transparency and machine learning, which is legibility, the ability to audit, and creating spaces for impact and interaction. And then using design to explain what's happening inside of an algorithm, a data product, or a data model, and a product. Legibility is inspired by 18F's Plain Language Guide to Designing for the Federal Government and Civil Servants. So 18F is a design and content strategy group that's a part of the US federal government. What they've done is they've created a flexible system and an asset for civil servants and bureaucrats to help explain what bureaucracy is to everyday people. And it's called the Plain Language Guide. Legibility is inspired by this. Legibility is explaining in plain language what a product and algorithm is doing. Legibility can be showing or explaining what is in a data set. We could call this data ingredients, which brings us to deeper questions of should data sets have ratings, explanations, and readable labels. Drugs in the United States have approval processes that are tested. Food has their ingredients and caloric information listed. And while this idea isn't perfect, I think we need to start thinking about these labeling systems that can create accountability for algorithms and data that users can read, that they can interact with, that they can see. What if algorithms came with this kind of labeling? What if they even came with this kind of rating? So taking this a step forward, let's actually try to imagine this framework in action. And I'll tell you an adjacent story that is a little funny. I had a really awful breakup a couple of years ago with a boy who had the hair of a Disney prince. And I'm sure, as a lot of you have done here, I drowned myself in music, and my Spotify drug of choice was this band called Mumford & Sons. And I don't even really like that band very much, but I listened to it every single day for 2 months. Like, that was the only band I listened to. If you know anything about machine learning, what I did is I overtrained my Spotify Discover Weekly. To this day, I still get Mumford & Sons suggestions. I broke up with this motherfucker 4 years ago. Okay, I still get like pop, folk recommendations to this day. And there's no way for me in Discover Weekly to like suppress that information. And that sucks because Spotify's Discover Weekly is my favorite product that uses machine learning. And I feel personally responsible for ruining it. So I made this sketch for Harvard's Shorenstein Center for a publication we did called Privacy on Design. Now, this may seem really innocuous, but I think it's important to ask, why can't I intervene in my favorite product? Why can't I intervene in an entertainment product that I love and use every single day? No one's going to die from a messed up Discover Weekly, though I feel like I may. But why can't I, right? Because if an algorithm is looking for user flags and cues, some of those cues may not be good. So what you're looking at here under the eye is me hypothesizing how you could sort of explain visually through graphs in plain language how the Discover Weekly algorithm was sort of made, right? High level, it's not giving away any trade secrets, but just enough for me to understand, like, what is it doing? What is Discover Weekly? And if there's a white paper, because I'm sure there is somewhere about this, it's also linked to that. Then on the other side, what you see is a space for me as a user that gives me just some high-level information about my data and how it relates to Discover Weekly. And then a space at the bottom for me to elevate content I'm actually interested in and potentially remove content. So why don't more products that use machine learning and artificial intelligence have spaces for interaction like this? Because again, if an algorithm is just ambiently looking for cues, some of those cues may be wrong. And this pulls specifically from my Designing for Transparency methodology because it allows for spaces of user intervention, as well as creating a legible interface for people to interact with. And it embodies a human rights-centered design mindset. So human rights-centered design puts user agency first by always focusing on consent. Everything should have a way for a user to say yes or no. Human rights-centered design is data protection first, recognizing that data is human inherently always. This methodology doesn't design only with opt-out in mind. Human rights-centered design is participatory by nature, designs for the global south first, centers on a diversity of experiences, and understands that localization is different than translation, that language and access is key and design is integral to that. It actively asks what could possibly go wrong in a product, and for all shades of the problem, from the benign to the extreme, and then plans for those use cases. Because it views use cases not as edge cases. Human rights-centered design knows a bug is a feature until you fix it. So thank you.